Hi there, Care Prevention, and welcome to our module over exertional heat illness. And I want to first point out that the title says exertional, and that means that you're doing something to cause a heat illness to occur. And so many of us have had this happen. In fact, I would argue that probably all of us have had one of these conditions happen to us, and many of us live in a state of dehydration anyways. But is it caused from exertion? Did you do an effort, an activity that caused this to happen? And that's really kind of where we have to come to first. So to begin, let's look at the idea of dehydration. And that just simply means that you're having and currently having a fluid imbalance in your body. We all know how important water is. We've probably studied that in other classes. But the idea that we do not consume enough fluids is easy to understand. But then when you couple that with the fact of an athletic effort over 1 or 2 hours even, or maybe even longer than that, then the idea of dehydration becomes even more important to address. And so one of the things that I want to start off with, and this video is dedicated more to the recognition of exertional heat illness, and then the video that follows this, I speak very briefly about the prevention and treatment of exertional heat illness. But one of the things that we need to be very aware of is that the day of restriction on fluids during practice has gone. We need to be very open and very available, or make fluids very available for our athletes. I've seen it written before that fluids need to be ad libitum, and that is just Latin for whenever they want, or the liberty to have. And so what we want to do is we want to give those opportunities to our athletes whenever we can. What we have found is that over and over and over, the research tells us that a hydrated athlete through their athletic event will recover quicker, and so that they can perform better in the next practice or event. And so why wouldn't you want that for your athlete? I realize that you've probably all watched a movie where from back in the day where football teams weren't allowed to have water, and how manly that made them. But the reality is they just didn't have the science we did. And the science tells us if you hydrate appropriately, you're going to recover. And if you recover, you're going to perform better in the next bout. And so it's all about recovery at that point. Why wouldn't you want that athlete to recover? So dehydration is pretty easy to spot. You inform your athletes of a simple little rule, and that is watch your urine. If your urine is clear like water or lightly yellow, then you're hydrated. If it's dark like apple juice, then you're dehydrated. And so another thing is if your urine has a strong smell to it, and that would also indicate dehydration. One of the things that doesn't always indicate dehydration is thirst. We know that most people will get water or fluids through their thirst, but it doesn't always make up for everything that they need. And one of the things I talk about in the next video is a weight chart. And this is a very unique thing. After a long, drawn-out effort during hot periods of the year, we can see a person lose substantial weight. And when I say substantial, I mean 8 to 10 pounds is not off the table for some of our heavier athletes to lose, and that's just in sweat and fluids. And so if they lose that much, then they're going to be at deficit on the next bout of exercise. And how do they replace it? Well, we'll talk about that in the next video. But to move forward, we know that these 3 conditions right here have a lot to do with the first thing, and that is dehydration. So your job first, and it took me several minutes to get this point across, hydrate your athletes. Make it open to them. Make it available to them. So what is a heat cramp? Well, there's a lot of debate about what a heat cramp is, and from my position, and I have done some research on heat cramps, and I really feel like that heat cramps, and they may in fact have to do with sodium and potassium, and I'm not going to say that they don't, but what I am going to say to you is that what I see most of the time is they have to do with conditioning. And the people that cramp, typically they cramp because they have taken their body beyond what it's conditioned to do. Either that is beyond the intensity that they're available or that they had available, or beyond the duration that they had available or what they're used to. And so it's just simply how hard you work for how long you work. And we don't always prepare for that. I think about football practices lasting 1 or 2 hours, and the intensity is not as high as which is in a game, and you start to see people cramping as early as the second and third quarter in football games because they're not used to going that hard for that long. And so my big position is make sure we're conditioning our athletes. Now that doesn't mean that you drag them out through the heat for 5 hours, but it does mean that you give attention to what it is that you're going to do, and that you also give some room on your expectations of what your athlete can do, and that they need to have expectations about what they can do. Next on my list is heat exhaustion, and I think we've probably all dealt with heat exhaustion. We've been too long out in the sun, out in the heat, and then we develop some fatigue, we develop a headache, we don't want to eat, we're just feeling kind of crummy, and we're not using the bathroom very much, which speaks a lot about our hydration level, because if you don't go very often, that tells you there's not a lot of fluids to get out. And so frequency of urine is a big hydration indicator. But if you look at it, these are the people who have just spent too much time out there. They weren't conditioned to it, and now they're having some problems physiologically from that. And you can see the list of symptoms in your text. But these people typically are treated with just getting them into a cooler environment, getting their fluids up, getting them some food when they're able to eat, and letting them rest. And so what you're looking for is if you go to a 2-a-days practice in football, you're going to find some people who are developing heat exhaustion, and whether or not they come back the next day prepared for that event is really up to their hydration, but also their food and rest. And they need to spend a lot of time in a cooler environment to help kind of relax that down. Last on our list is heat stroke. Heat stroke is a medical emergency when it comes to exertional heat illness. This is the one that is going to cause a potentially sudden death in the sport, and many people have died from heat stroke. Many people have survived it as well. And so what we can do is we can take those people who have survived it and we can learn a lot from it so that we can prevent that in the future. What I need you to understand is that heat cramps, heat exhaustion, they are not continuums or predicators to a heat stroke episode. A heat stroke happens completely independently. It doesn't need heat exhaustion or heat cramps to happen before it happens. So you're not looking for a sequential order to occur. You're looking for this thing right here, 104 degree core temperature. Now you're probably asking yourself, how do I discover what the core temperature is? Well, there's really only a couple of ways, and the one quickest way is a rectal thermometer and a rectal temp. And I don't know if you're sitting there thinking about doing a rectal temp on a high school football player or not, but I'm telling you that's the only way you can discover what their core temperature is. And so if you examine them that way, kudos to you. For me, I'm going to look for other clinical signs and symptoms, and I'm going to shut them down first before I even consider they could get heat stroke. I'm going to stop them, and we're going to do the treatment protocol right then, and you'll see that here in the next video. But the big signs and symptoms are that they have hot skin. Now, they could have sweaty skin, and in most cases, in an exertional heat stroke, they're going to have sweaty skin because they have been exerted. They're still active, but what we know is the hypothalamus has literally shut down the operating system that causes sweat to occur, so they may actually dry out because the brain has said, I can't do this anymore. I've got to have these things for me to operate. And so if you stop cooling the body, it literally cooks itself from the inside out. And that's what a heat stroke is. It's not a stroke in the respect that you have a blood clot or some kind of event that occurs in the brain other than the brain saying, I'm not cooling the body anymore. And so you literally cook. These people die a very slow death because the body shuts down almost sequentially by shutting down different systems in the body. But when we can prevent this by seeing it and seeing high humidity and and high ambient temperatures and the high heat index, then we've done ourselves a lot more good. But the idea that we can prevent it every time is kind of unlikely. So what we want to do is we want to treat it when it happens. Again, though, you're looking for that core temperature of 104. If you don't want to do a rectal temp, I certainly don't blame you. But what you do have to do is you have to know the clinical signs. Look in your textbook, understand that the big clinical signs are the sweating or the hot, dry skin. Also, knowing that they will start to have a very diminished cognitive and even conscious state. This person may collapse, and if that happens, then you need to start your emergency medical procedure, your emergency action plan, have an emergency action team ready to go who is trained, and they have taken care of the things that they need to take care of before this happens, because there's a lot of work to do if you have a heat stroke. If you have any questions, please make sure you're emailing me. Make sure you're also watching the other videos that are supplementing mine down below. See you soon.